in this podcast where we're looking at box office bombs, I think a good question to ask is, in addition to how do they get made, who gets blamed for the film when they bomb? And does the bad press associated with a film so much to the point where it prejudices reviewers, fans, studios? So with today's episode, we will perhaps look, I think, definitely the most, if not the biggest, then the most significant box office bomb ever in Hollywood. It basically ended the era of 70s filmmaking. It bankrupted the Studio United Artists. It had a stain on the land. But yet, is it perhaps, quite possibly, a great film? So, hi, I'm Cody Lumpkin, and here with me today is Ian Nolte, and we both work at Marshall University, and we're here to talk about 1980s Heaven's Gate. Before we get started, we have to do those disclaimer things. So, disclaimer, the opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions and beliefs of Marshall University Libraries, the Department of English, Marshall Film Studies, or HerdCon. And given the subject matter of this film today, I would like to post a warning, something just to be aware of. Heaven's Gate depicts scenes of violence, animal abuse, alcohol abuse, and rape. These just might be things that come up, so a little blanket trigger warning to get going here. So
those are good things to know about that movie if you tend to sit down and watch it cold.
Yeah. I mean, if that's something you're comfortable with, this, I would say it's very much in the tone and style of American 1970s filmmaking. This is stuff you would see, violence, sexual violence. It would be very common to see.
Well, yeah.
So we this film came out. It was released at the end of 1980, and then was re-released in 1981. A little factoids about its budget. It had a budget. It had an initial budget. This is what it got greenlit for. Was an initial budget of $11.6 million. It ended up costing $46 million. So that is 4 times more than it was. And its box office was $3.2 million. So that is an enormous loss. Also, little fun facts about the film. It was one that the director did not want to edit, so it could, even when it bombed, it couldn't make any money in TV broadcast because he didn't want to cut for commercials or cut anything out. So, if you might be familiar with the Godfather saga, is that kind of combines Godfather 1 and Godfather 2 in this kind of chronological order thing that would play on TV in the later 70s, I think. And that was something probably made a lot of money for Paramount at the time. But yeah, this film did not have this, so it had no way other than watching it at the theater or watching it on video years later to anyone to see this film. And it was so the critics were terrible, harsh on it. They thought that Michael Cimino, the director, was an egomaniac, and so this was one that just. And I think it's also like that. Sometimes media and Hollywood itself relishes the destruction of a film, even as a studio is constantly throwing more and more money to get it made. It's kind of that sunk cost thing. Well, we spent $20 million. Let's spend another 20 to at least get the thing made.
Yeah, that is so interesting to me because I have never seen this movie. This is one of those movies that I've only ever read about in my entire life. And the things I understand about Heaven's Gate before viewing it were it's this enormous sort of ego-driven production that ballooned in cost and was uneditable, like just a long, expensive movie that the director refused to fix for mass audiences, that audiences rejected it and it got really bad reviews, like this movie that has this enormous stink of failure about it. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was a really interesting film to sort of approach from that position, because the question is I'd never watched this movie, I'd only ever read about it, and I think sometimes when you are dealing with a film as it's released, a movie will get that stink on it, oh, this is a big failure, and it will it sometimes drive you away from the movie or even color your perceptions as you watch the movie. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was really interesting to watch divorced from that, like just like trying to keep that as minimized in my mind as I press play on it, just like trying to watch it as a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, when I watched it, I was just like, why didn't people think this movie was great? Like, this is a cool movie.
Yeah, I do think oftentimes having it becomes that, it's not that old as a movie. I am older than this movie. But it has this aspect of a historical artifact, so we can look at it from a distance, and it doesn't have that. Oh my God, you've been reading. I've been reading articles about it in my local newspaper or on Entertainment Tonight, wherever it would be at the time, that there's just a disaster happening and stay away from this thing. It's diseased or something like that.
Yeah, just glancing at the numbers, I was trying to like contextualize, because that's the thing I'd always heard about this movie is like, oh, it was so expensive to make and it was so long. So I just kind of investigated a little bit, like, what does that really mean? So it cost $46 million to make, which now that would be like a cheap movie.
Yeah.
But what does that number mean in 1980? Well, it cost roughly twice as much as Raiders of the Lost Ark. So I think in 1980 you didn't want to be a movie that cost 2 times as much as Raiders of the Lost Ark. That was like a huge mistake. If you wanted to be a profitable film, you couldn't be clocking your budget at more than double the Raiders budget.
And in the case of Raiders, Spielberg and Lucas were trying to make a cheaper film because he had just had his own bomb with 1941. Spielberg had. It's like, I got to do something quick and dirty. So that's a rather modest budget for that film.
The highest grossing films of 1981 were Raiders of the Lost Ark, On Golden Pond, and Superman 2. So that kind of helps me put this story into context. Like, what did the theaters look like the weekend it came out? What else was playing? What was doing well? What was in the popular conversation? And all of those movies cost. On Golden Pond cost $15 million, but Superman 2 was a big, expensive film. It cost $54 million, so much more expensive than Heaven's Gate, but also much more profitable.
Yeah. And the little factoid of it, they originally were filming Superman and Superman 2 simultaneously, and then because it had gotten so expensive, they broke off, just put out Superman 1, changed directors from Richard Donner to Richard Lester, and he added a bunch of stuff so he could get directing credit for Superman 2.
Yeah.
So that was a whole thing. But yeah, it was one of the Superman was a big success, so Superman 2 was going to be a big success as well.
Yeah. And then like the other thing that always like haunts this movie is its length. It is a long movie. This movie is 3 hours and 39 minutes long. At least the cut I watched was that long. I think there are multiple cuts of this movie that address that length issue to varying degrees of success. But it is a long sit. But then I was just trying to 3 hours and 40 minutes. What does that really mean? Like, how does it compare to other movies? So I think right now we are existing in a period where people are just much more accepting of long movies. Like, you will very frequently go to the movie theater to see a big movie that is over 3 hours. I remember driving to see The Batman, and just like just as I parked my car and walked into the theater and sat down, I was just obsessed with this thing's like 3 hours and 20 minutes long. And I just said, if I get bored, the minute I get bored, I am leaving. Well, then I never did. Batman was great.
Yeah, it's a good movie. Very good.
So, I don't know, Oppenheimer was 3 hours. This is a movie that's 40 minutes longer than Oppenheimer. So if you were sitting through Oppenheimer and starting to squirm at the end, there's another 45 minutes to go in this film. It's The Return of the King, which is a very long, successful movie theater movie. It was 3 hours and 20 minutes, so it's 20 minutes longer than that.
They could have probably cut out 30 minutes. 30 minutes at the end there, I'm thinking.
But interestingly, it's almost the exact same length of Lawrence of Arabia, which might be a film you use as sort of like an example of a very successful box office attraction. So audiences will turn out for a 4-hour movie if it is attractive to them.
Yeah, and that's usually like your big spectacle shows that you're not getting. You're not going to a double feature when you see anything over 3. That is the main film that you're going to watch. And some of these films would have intermissions. Given their length, they have intermissions, so you can get more snacks and go to the bathroom and things like that. Yeah. So.
I didn't know this about Raiders of the Lost Ark. The biggest box office attraction in 1980, Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was only 115 minutes long, so it wasn't even. It was 5 minutes short of 2 hours. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Raiders of the Ark is a fleet movie. It just does its business and gets off the screen.
Yeah, I appreciate that about the film. And yeah, and even I think even like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is only like 2 hours and 3 or 7 minutes, and then that last Raiders film it's like way too long. Just a Raider, an Indiana Jones should be something under 2 hours, just a little under 2 hours. You're in and you're out. But, yet,
yeah. When I sat down to this movie, those were the impressions I had in my mind. Oh, it cost too much money. It's way too long, and people really didn't like it in 1980. I did know it had like a critical reevaluation over the years, but I just remember in 1980 it was this reviled picture, like a symbol of 70s excess, as we were entering like 80s excess in a different way.
Yeah. My mom, my mom said she really loved the film. She was a huge Chris Christopherson fan, so maybe that had a little bit to do with it. But she thought, I loved it. People would talk bad about it. She's like, I love that film.
You had told me this was your mom's favorite movie.
It's one of her
favorite
it's up there,
movies.
yeah.
So I had that when I clicked play on this movie. I was like, this is Cody's mom's favorite movie. And the second it opened and I saw that young Chris Christopherson, I was like, I get it.
That young Chris Christopherson.
I know what she is right. Like there is something about this one. Yeah, so my ideas with it, when approaching it, were just those ideas. Like, it was too long, it was too expensive, and it just flopped at the box office. And when I was watching it, one of the central questions was its length, because it was a long movie. And I watched it on Amazon Prime, and I did not watch it in one contiguous viewing. So I watched it over a series. Like, I watched it in like 3 sessions, which maybe made it easier viewing for me. Yeah. But also, it made me think about it like if this were a modern film text, wouldn't this be like an HBO miniseries? Like, wouldn't you like? It is a big story.
Yeah.
It is a long story. There's a lot of characters, and couldn't you flesh this out to be more like 8 hours and 8 episodes? And wouldn't that like feel like a really big epic thing? And wouldn't audiences really like flock to that? Like, if you say I have a big expensive 4-hour movie for you, someone's like, ooh, gross. But if you're like, I have a big expensive 8-hour story for you, cut up into 8 episodes, you're like, oh, I can't wait.
Where you'll actually watch more.
Yeah.
And I believe some of his Cimino's initials were like 5.5 hours. That he was like, okay, this is how I like it, and they kept making him cut and cut.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was something I feel like it was like network TV in the late 80s and early, like these like 2 or 3 night miniseries events. Like, I think it would lend itself a little. I think structurally there would be things to do, but I think that would be an appealing thing. It's like, what's going to happen to this upcoming war that's going to happen here and everything.
Yeah. I did like approaching the story for the first time. Like, I knew some things. Like, I knew it was a Western starring Chris Christopherson. I knew it was like a 70s movie. It came out in 1980, but this is a 70s movie. Yeah. Also, I really have a lot of affection for Cimino's movie that came out before this one. What's that movie called?
The Deer Hunter.
The Deer Hunter.
Yeah. Which won Best Picture.
Which won Best Picture and is another long, violent 70s movie. And it takes place in like the steel towns of like Pennsylvania, which my father grew up in Wheeling, so I always feel like when I watch that movie, I've always like feel like this great connection to like these were my father's peers, the men in steel towns in that part of the world who went to Vietnam. So like I always feel like I get this window into like what life was like at that point in time in history in that movie. And The Deer Hunter is a great movie. So like when I click play on the Heaven's Gate, I'm like, well, there's this Western that's really long and expensive by this director I really like. All these things are adding up to something that I would be into. Why has it taken me so long to get around to Heaven's Gate? And part of it is just that story. Like, the story is it's too long, it costs too much, it stinks.
Yeah. And the guy was an egomaniac, and yeah.
Well, sometimes, you want your directors to be an egomaniac.
You want them to have confidence, yeah, but not, the levels of sociopathic behavior, I suppose.
Yeah. When I click play on this movie, one of the first things that grabbed me was the way it is very much packaged as Cimino's work. Like, it opens as written and directed by Michael Cimino, Christopher Christopherson in a Michael Cimino film. Like, very much like, well, as it would be, as the guy who made The Deer Hunter, the Best Picture winner from a few years ago, a big successful movie. Here's another one, and I did feel that energy and excitement in it as the credits play. Like, oh yeah, here we go. This is the 70s movie I never checked out. I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, and it, it's as far as a film that hits the ground running, it literally has Chris Christopherson's character Jim Averill. He's running to graduation, which I always think it's a film noir, Kiss Me Deadly. I'm teaching in class right now, and it opens with a woman running barefoot just in a trench coat. And I was like, yeah, I think that's always a good way to open your films, just have a character running. Yeah, because you're like, why are they running?
That was one of the things that grabbed me. Right at the opening is it opens with Chris Christopherson running to Harvard graduation, and he runs into this giant rotunda, and it just opens up, and it is a fantastic location. This gigantic, I think they might not have shot it at Harvard, but
they shot it at Oxford.
Yeah, but this gigantic like academic setting with this multi-tiered like ballroom rotunda with all the like faculty and regalia on the steps, and then like an observation deck above them. Every frame of it packed with human beings, like hundreds and hundreds of people in this giant space. And that presentation is so like, I'm like, oh yeah, this is why this movie cost $46 million. This is a huge movie. This is the opening sequence. We aren't even at the part that's a Western yet, and they have spent so much money on this graduation scene.
It's Magdalen College, and that is where Chris Christopherson, who was a Rhodes Scholar, by the way, that's where he went to college when he was on his Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford. So he probably knew where he was going when he was running. He'd walk those commons many times. But yeah, it is just so. And again, it's not this kind of CGI thing where like somebody is working over a computer for hundreds of hours. It's just they're just people that are all set up.
This movie does have a cast of, well, maybe not thousands, but at least hundreds and hundreds. Yeah, so a big movie. And I was just so impressed by the scope of just that initial sequence, which is ultimately not like, it seems like when you look at a movie that costs too much, it seems like maybe someone in the production could have said, maybe this Harvard sequence doesn't need to be this big. There are bigger things to spend our money on later. But no, it is a big, expensive opening.
Yeah.
And that graduation scene does really like set the central theme for the story, is the person presiding over the Harvard graduation speaking to the students, and he is looking to them as a class of educated people, and he sets for them the challenge. We are building a nation. I forget what year the story takes place, but in the 1800s.
Yeah, 1880s. I think.
The 1880s, and he challenges you are the elite class of educated people, and his challenge for them is you are to go into the world and you are going to mingle the cultivated mind with the uncultivated mind as you build a nation. And he lays out this big challenge to these young people, and you see how they take it. For example, Chris Christopherson seems to take it very seriously, but his friend, not so much.
Yeah, Irvin. Well, Billy Irvin is played by John Hurt, who, interestingly enough, he was making this film. He had to go and make The Elephant Man. So he left, made The Elephant Man with David Lynch, which he got an Academy Award nomination and probably would have won Best Actor if not for Raging Bull and Robert De Niro. And then comes back and finishes the film. And interesting, like he seems like he's just gone for long periods in the film. But yeah, and I remember his speech was basically like, says nothing. It's like, we'll just be here and do our thing. And then is literally a character who literally does that. It's like, why are you are educated, you are the orator of the class, and you contribute nothing but your just constant drinking and sarcasm.
And they transition from that graduation scene to this big dance on the lawn where they're on this rotunda with what appear to be 100 waltzers, like dancing in a big circle around this tree on the college campus. It's a beautiful dance sequence, and immediately I was put in mind of like a film I love, The Deer Hunter, which opens with this tremendous, enormous like wedding sequence. And I thought like, oh yeah, this film, Cimino is obsessed with like these like he likes a big dance and a big party, and he puts lots of dances and parties in this movie and his other movies, and there's some like sort of like power to him in that big social celebration, a wedding, a dance, a graduation, these meetings of people for celebrations.
Just look at all the moving parts, and just you just kind of take it in. And I suppose it's like as someone who views and analyzes film, it's one of those things like, boy, that was probably really hard. And just to get everybody on the same page and do it right, that's staggering. But then it also takes me out of the film a little bit. It doesn't have that effortless feel to it. It's like, I'm really working hard to impress you.
Oh, this is a sweaty film.
Yeah.
Like it went on this. This is a film that wants you to know how hard it was to get these images on the screen. Yeah, it's definitely like a big movie that wants to remind you that it's a big movie. Ultimately, this film is a Western, and one of the things
we get to that.
Yeah, one of the things that impressed me so much about it was how this is a Western that tries to give you the opposite of all the things you'd expect from a Western.
Yeah.
Like, it's an inverted Western. Like, for example, that John Hurt character we were just talking about, like, in a Western from like the 1930s or 40s, you might expect to meet the town drunk.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's the town drunk, except he is one of the most prestigious Harvard graduates in the country who goes on to a gigantic career in the U.S. federal government. So, like, who's the town drunk? The silliest character in the whole movie?
Yeah.
One of the most important men in the country. Like, this whole huge inversion of that character expectation.
Yeah, I mean, probably already having a privileged life to begin with, that he could just go somewhere and sit at the mansion or whatever. Also, you think about this takes place in like the 1890s, and it's also the Gilded Age, so there's just massive amount of wealth, and the 1% of the 1% kind of thing. They're in control. These are the Harvard grads, so and he's just out there playing cowboy out there.
Well, the scope of the movie was so beautiful, and I do think that Western setting. Do you know where they filmed this at all?
They had filmed some of the parts were around Medicine Lake, Montana, and some of the big city scenes. They had filmed in Glacier. One of the things I read, they had put soil over. They brought soil in over parking areas in Glacier, and it was like not native to so there's like an ecological disaster, because you want to kind of preserve the natural habitat. And so they were doing all this stuff they shouldn't have been doing in national parks, which is why it's so hard to film in national parks now when films do that. But Glacier, and they'd filmed parts in Idaho and things like that. It's clearly like Northern Rockies, because you can see how sharp and cut the mountains are there.
I think in the story it's portrayed as Casper, Wyoming,
Yeah.
and just huge and beautiful wide open spaces. Like, the Western town in this movie is so big and complete. Like, when we first get there, this big establishing shot of it, and I was just marveling at it because it's such a beautiful like set, and it's this entire Western town, which you do not really, I think, need for the entire movie. But it's a shot of the entire downtown area, and like every chimney in the shot has this giant smoke roaring out of it. Whereas, like, there's just every shot is so much involved in it, and so much work goes into every shot.
It was built from the ground up. That whole town was built. They built it themselves.
Very early in the town, there's this scene where Chris Christopherson and Richard Masur are having a conversation on the street in Casper, and the entire time they're talking, there are just carriages roaring by like it's a highway, and it's just like every frame of this movie is filled with so much business and so many props and so many constructions, and it's so like loud and quick and noisy. It's just like the movie can't have enough going on in every single shot.
It is a meticulous film. There's one scene where you see underneath Chris Christopherson's character, Jim Averill, is trying to find his boots, and he looks under his bed. And for some reason, I think that is the exact right amount of dust and junk that would accumulate there if you hadn't been there in a while. That somebody thought, the production design staff thought to do that, and the director that's the kind of detail we're talking about.
Oh yeah, wonderful production design, like a great and fantastic sets. Like the roller rink set is such an amazing location, like a thing I never would have like imagined or constructed in my mind. This beautiful, gigantic roller rink with a tent over it that's used almost like a revival hall and like a party plaza.
And like you have your kind of community meetings there and arguments and.
Also, I've known about the movie Heaven's Gate for as long as I've known about movies, but I don't feel like anyone ever clearly explained to me that Heaven's Gate was a roller rink.
Yeah.
I feel like if someone ever said that to me, I'd been more interested in the movie.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of 70s. You had kind of roller rinks. Xanadu came a little bit later, but they're kind of like, it's a Western, but we'll have some roller rink action in it. We'll have some roller skating in it.
There's a sign at the roller rink. The character who built it, the Jeff Bridges character, he has built it as kind of like it's this great merger of like roller rink and snake oil salesman, which I can even like conceive of as a story. But he has this great sign on the roller rink: "Skating cures nervous disorders." And I just thought that was like just the funniest idea. Like this guy builds this roller rink as a scam. It's also a real roller rink, but he also builds it as a health cure, and it becomes this like the center for this community. It's like such a wild idea packed into a movie full of wild ideas.
Yeah. And I think what also, it's a Western, but you have a lot of blending. I had read basically that everything was period accurate in the way that it's something from a period era photograph. There's something like that. But you see characters who are dressed in kind of more urban ways, different caps. It's not all Western cowboy hats. And so it has this blending of like the more urban styles and the kind of look of the immigrants. The kind of Eastern Europeans are still wearing similar clothing and hats that they would wear when they were in Russia or in Slavic countries.
Yeah, the styling of the movie is very unlike any other Western I've ever seen. It's really compelling, I think, where it's like a cowboy movie that doesn't look like a cowboy movie. It's really interesting in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and people with fur hats on.
Yeah.
It's all these little, like, and again, like, what, to what I guess the idea you go play cowboy now somewhere, you get the hat and you get the chaps and you get all these things to look like it, but and I think it shows kind of the ways in which these people haven't adapted to the land in any way. But they're also clinging to their traditions and their own identity, because the land is something that is not pleasant. None of these. It's Wyoming historically. It's Wyoming. Things are rough. I will say it's not good to farm in Wyoming. There's not a long growing season. The soil's not good. So in the environmental impact levels, cattle is going to be marginally less destructive than farming, although for thousands of years we had a little thing called the American bison that did just fine and nurtured the land and ate all the grass, and it was all great. And then we killed all those and replaced them with cattle. And also one of the things we don't see is we see no Native Americans in the film, because they have been removed, they've been extinguished in some way. So it is very much a settler colonial type Western after that era of the Western.
But the central conflict in this story I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
Like, if you think of a Western movie from the decades previous to this film, you think of it as the story of winning the American West, of like venturing out into the frontier and then claiming it as part of the American empire, and that's sort of like the goal or aim of the movie. But this movie is about the conflict between the immigrant people who are populating the land, and then the corporations that control the resources. So the big conflict is Sam Waterston is a representative of the Stock Growers Association of America, who control all the cattle. They have been raising cattle there, and the big issue is people keep stealing them because they are starving. And stolen cattle has become a big economy in that local area. So their solution is they have developed a list of 125 immigrants they are going to murder. And they're going to execute these representatives from these 125 families as a way to send a message that you cannot steal cattle from the American stock growers. And immediately I was impressed with the idea of like the way this sets up the big American empire business as the enemy in this film. Like, they are the bad guys. Yeah.
And historically, that is accurate because, it was during like conflicts in the West with Native American tribes. They were not fighting cowboys and outlaws. They were fighting the federal government. They were fighting the cavalry. They were fighting our army. And army doing tactics like mass killing off buffalo, cutting off food sources, doing things to try to corral them and get them onto reservations and things like that. It was not John Wayne and a couple of buddies saving the day. And I think this is one that shows, the antagonist, what we see as in a kind of traditional Western, what gets promoted, that civilization in quotes, the civilization, the kind of making the West for good, decent, wholesome people. This is the exact opposite here. The people that just want to try to make a living, they're the one that space is not for them either. It's for the people who are rich, who already have enough money, and they just want more.
And the central conflict being based around the Stock Growers Association and the immigrant working class, immediately it's reminded me of one of my favorite movies, which was another 1980s movie, Matewan from 1987, which is another movie that's styled like a Western, but the conflict is about the people in financial and political power versus the working class. And this movie I thought was like Matewan if you spent $46 million making it. It's Matewan is a shorter movie, a less expensive movie. I was maybe heartbroken to look up the facts and realize that Matewan didn't do very well at the box office. I never really investigated if that was a big hit or not, and it turns out no. But I have had the experience of watching Matewan with 2 sold-out audiences before in my life, and that is a movie that works. It is structured like a Western. It tells an interesting story, and when it gets to the part that is delivering a climactic good guy versus bad guy Western climax, the audience is on board. And every time I've seen that movie with a crowd, it gets big cheers and applause for this 40-year-old movie. And this movie I was just so curious about as it went along. Can it deliver that on this scale? Can it deliver an action climax like that? And what I discovered was, for an hour it goes on and on with one of the biggest action climaxes I think I've ever seen in a movie. I think the original, it was 90 minutes. That final battle was so it was really, really long. I mean, it is kind of it's like there's this kind of last straw. And it's exciting to see. You see the immigrant families. They've been pushed too far, and they just grab a bunch of guns and they start riding like a bunch of maniacs. And just hundreds and hundreds of extras in this enormous gun battle that is almost the last third of the movie.
The Stock Growers Association has hired gunmen, have armed them. These are all these guys in these long dusters, which to me, when I watch anybody in a long duster, is not to be trusted. They are bad. Whatever the color, the long duster is like you are an agent of evil in some way if you got the long duster. So they have 100 or 50. They have a bunch of these gunmen, well trained. They have no problem killing people if necessary, and it's against the immigrants, and so they have it literally. It is literally a circle the wagons kind of moment.
There is the climax of this movie is the band of immigrants, and they have encircled the hired guns, and they are whipping wagons around them, and it is full-scale wagons, full horse teams moving at what looks like 100 miles an hour,
full speed, in
a gigantic real circle in a gigantic real field. This movie has horse stunts that are unimaginable.
I do believe some Cimino had lawsuits against him for injuries of some horses in it. It's always hard to tell when you see a horse get hurt. Sometimes they're trick horses and they're well trained to do that, and sometimes they're not. But usually you'll find out where the lawsuits come at. That's where you find that out.
There's some horses in this movie that take a tumble.
There's a lot of that.
That reminded me a lot of Akira Kurosawa's Ran, which is a movie that came out in 1985, another big 80s movie. At the time, it cost $10 million to make, but at the time that was the biggest budget Japanese film of all time, and it was another box office disappointment at the end of Kurosawa's career. It is not. It's not a Western. It is like a samurai Shakespeare film, but it's
a retelling of King Lear.
It's a long movie that climaxes in a bunch of horse stunts, and in this movie put me in mind of that, just like the sheer amount of fight choreography and battle reenactment and on these gigantic scale with hundreds of horses and hundreds of warriors. I just thought it was interesting. Those two movies from the 80s also
Yeah.
had shared the same story of being so expensive and then not having box office returns.
I think too, this is a film like Heaven's Gate gets considered like an anti-Western, that kind of thing that subverts the expectations and values, and it's something that, while that ending is very, it's glory. I'm impressed. It's a spectacle. There's an intimacy to it because it is over a relatively small. There are big wide shots of where this actual battle occurs, but it also feels so pointless and wasteful at the same time.
Well, this is, like you say, an anti-Western.
Yeah.
And the reason the Western genre was successful is because they had happy endings.
Mm-hmm.
Like the cowboy in the white hat shot the cowboy in the black hat and kissed the girl, and you were excited.
Mm-hmm.
The West was civilized, and the right people were in charge. That's like the moral of a 1930s Western,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is a movie where the cavalry comes in, but that's a tragedy. Like the cavalry arrives at the end, but they don't save the day. They ruin the story of our heroes.
Yeah, basically right before everybody dies, because they're dying. They're trying to fight for something, and then the cavalry comes in, and the cavalry, Captain Minardi, played by Terry O'Quinn, that was his first film, and his character is like. There's a scene earlier where Jim Ambrose, Chris Christopherson's character, like, do you think you can help us? You're part of the federal government. And they're like playing baseball. They're playing a baseball game out in a field. He's like, I have to follow orders. I can't, this is what I only do what the government tells me to do. Don't blame me. I'm not part of the problem, but I'm just the mechanism that does it. Fun fact about Terry O'Quinn. This was his first film. And he basically got cast by Cimino, and he said, "Do you know how to ride a horse?" And he's like, "No." Well, here you go. He's on contract, so he couldn't do anything else until it happened. So I think he was living around in Maryland, Baltimore, or something like that. And so he went and rode horses to be competent. And he did that about a year, way before they thought, we'll call you in a couple months. So it took like a year, and then happened. The person was his trainer. They fell for each other and ended up getting married. They were married for 31 years, and they had 2 kids. So this is a film. The making of this film created life. And while they're no longer married, in an interview, I think it was Random Rolls on the AV Club, O'Quinn said, that was probably the best thing that came out of that film for me. But yeah, it's the cavalry saves the day, and they really don't save anything, and it is the most like deflating. And when they don't rush in that very cinematic way, they're just kind of like loafing. They're kind of going like the 3/4 step. Yeah, it's such a deflating. It's such an anticlimactic, deflating ending to that film.
They ride in, they save the bad guys, and then they seal the fate of our immigrant uprisers.
Yeah.
Terry O'Quinn, I think, has a line in this movie that's really like important to understand, like the theme, because one of the themes that weaves its way through is that idea that Chris Christopherson's character is from that elite class, and the elite class are the people who are organizing the federal government to squeeze out these immigrant families. And when he goes to visit Terry O'Quinn in the middle of the movie to get information about what the army knows about the hit list.
What's the hit list? Yeah.
I think it's Terry O'Quinn who tells him, "You're a rich man with a good name. You only pretend to be poor," which is the big conflict for Chris Christopherson. Is his conflict between who he belongs to and what he thinks is right, and how he tries to operate in between those two zones until he ultimately can't anymore.
Yeah. And he's very much that sense of, it's easy for him, in a sense, it's easy for him to leave if he wants to. He can always go home where he can be fabulously comfortable. That he's kind of like the rich son that I want to go be a productive member, help somebody in some way. And it's something that really comes through is that he can ultimately just leave the place, and
that's his plan for the entire movie.
Yeah.
is we can just leave now.
Yeah.
He is in love with Isabel Huppert, who lives in the territory, has made her life in the territory, and he wants to take her away from it. And she says, I cannot leave. And he is trying to get her to leave up until the final act of the movie when he realizes he has to stay to protect her. And then that idea that he always has that escape hatch of class. Like, I got a big expensive carriage. We can ride away on it today.
He's got his parachute, so to speak. And I think too, really, I mean, Isabel, who plays Ella in the film, is a wonderful. It's always like westerns can always be touchy about how they might have slightly feminist inclinations. While she is a proprietor of a brothel, she's a sex worker herself. It's her own business, and she runs her own business, and she exchanges. She basically becomes something of a cattle owner herself, because certain people are giving her stolen cattle for services at her brothel. But yeah, it is that sense of like, this is something I've built. I'm not going to leave it.
Yeah.
And along those same lines too, very much in say the opening scene of the graduation, you have all these dudes graduate and then you have these women that are like far up in the stand. They're just watching the guy. This is like women. It's like girls watching boys play video games.
They are the audience.
Yeah,
for the
they are
graduation.
the audience for the whole thing. They're like, there's a part where they're running around a tree, getting drunk and punching each other, and they're just watching and laughing, and they're not interacting. Now the women among the immigrant population, they are getting the guns, they are shooting, they are involved in the social debates and the conversations that the community. It seems much more egalitarian at that level.
That was something I found actually kind of shocking about the movie, because the whole time I was trying to watch it, I was trying to also think like, why might the audience of 1980 rejected this story besides just its length? I think this is a movie that is confrontational about violence in women, and particularly like in that closing sequence, the action sequence is built around these women who are the extras in the movie. They're the immigrant women who take up arms against these invading hired guns, and they shoot, and they are shot, and they die violently, and they cause violent, vicious deaths. And I thought that was a really like controversial idea, to have these women who are dressed like mothers with rifles getting shot at. Was like just like a powerful image in this film.
And not you get hit once and there's no blood. Women getting shot multiple times, also trying to fire back. So it is like they're not. None of the. There's no glorious death in this film. Everything.
They're soldiers on this battlefield in the third act of this movie.
Yeah, and I think some of that plays up to the openings. There's one of the many opening scenes of the film. We're introduced to Christopher Walken as Nate Champion.
Oh, he has like. That's one of that was one of the coldest introductions to a character I've ever seen in a movie. I was so excited about Christopher Walken's introduction in this movie.
Yeah, and he there's someone who has stolen stock association cattle, and his family's starving. He's getting food, and
I think in the context of the movie, we don't quite understand that maybe.
Yeah,
but he is a cattle thief.
Yeah,
and they are it is a family butchering a cow, man, woman, and child.
Yeah,
and they are butchering a cow, and they. In the context of the movie, they seem to be in a big hurry about it.
Yeah.
And then...
they've got a blanket.
They're hiding.
Yeah. And then, Christopher Walken walks up. He just pokes his rifle.
He's a silhouette through a sheet.
Yeah.
Just the shape of a tall man in a hat. Just that shadow creeps up, and it terrifies the man butchering the cattle. And then he shoots him through the sheet.
Yeah.
And we see that it's Christopher Walken, who's just murdered a family.
Yeah. And... out in the country like that, you kill the husband, everybody else is going to, the woman's going to have to take over. And so there was a reason. There's a reason why, and weirdly to say, but Wyoming was it's called the equality state. And the reason why, one of the reasons is that they were one of the first state. I think they were the first state to give women the right to vote, because of situations like that where they would be the sole householder. And that, hey, they this is property, and I have to work this land, and you can see the literal skin in the game that the women have, and also the desire for vengeance, understandably so.
Yeah. And that Christopher Walken character I thought was really interesting because in the first act he's established as he is the antagonist to Christopherson. He is a bad guy. He is a hired gun. He's hired by the Stockholders Association, and he executes people who he believes to be cattle thieves.
Yeah.
And that's the big theme of the movie is the Stock Association is legally right to be doing what they are doing, but morally wrong. And then the story for Chris Christopherson, I was really unexpected by it, how quickly it occurs that by the middle of the movie, he has changed his perspective. He realizes that he is doing something.
Oh, you mean Chris
Walken. Chris
Yeah,
Walken, I'm
yeah.
sorry. Christopher Walken's character, I was really unexpectedly, he had a turn in the middle of the movie that I was not anticipating where instead of being set up to be a confrontation at the end of the movie between these two characters who are on like parallel paths from opposite perspectives, he just jumps to Christopher Walken's side and says, oh yeah, or Christopherson's side.
They're both named Chris, so it can be a little confusing. But they look very distinct.
But Christopher Walken realizes, oh, this is morally wrong but legally right, so now I am another outlaw on the range, which I thought was a cool storytelling element for that.
Yeah, I think too, and this is where kind of the trigger warning comes in, that a lot of that is perpetuated because both Nate, as played by Christopher Walken, and Jim, as played by Chris Christopherson, are in love with Ella, and some of the agents go to the brothel and kill all the workers there, and then assault Ella in a very graphic scene. And it is a disturbing scene to watch for sure.
Yeah, it is that is a really like egregiously distressing scene that I do not think any modern filmmaker would take on.
Yeah.
Particularly because the way that violence against women is portrayed in this film, I do think that it is. This is, I think, a thing about 70s movies as well. Is the purpose of it is to rearrange the alignments of the male characters, and the story becomes about them seeking revenge for that violence.
It gives them something. It gives them a purpose.
Yeah, so it's really just like a plot. It's incredible violence used as a plot impetus for the male characters, which I think is that kind of violence doesn't necessarily work in stories. But it is something that 70s stories are filled with. Yeah.
I do think that it simply, in one thing, it hardens Ella to want to stay and to want to keep fighting. And her business is totally destroyed. Her people that were her friends and people that work for her are totally destroyed by what these like three guys. And one of them played by Tom Noonan, notable character actor, would do a lot of work years later. He's one of these thugs. But yeah, it is disconcerting. It's not. There's nothing that's pleasant to watch about it for sure.
I think a lot about that Ella character, and I'm not really quite cemented on her just yet. I really like her in the movie, and I think she's a fantastic character. I think if I just read the pages, I think that Ella character might feel a little light. She's important to the story, but I might read her as underwritten maybe.
Yeah.
But I think what makes her magical is Isabel Huppert, who is giving an all-star performance.
Yeah.
This performer is like she's known as like the queen of the Cannes Film Festival. She's the actress who's been in the Cannes Film Festival the most number of times. I do not know how early this was in her career, but it is very early.
It's one of her earlier films.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's like her first movie, but it's very early in her career.
I don't think she knew a lot of English when she signed up for the film. I think that works in a lot of ways for her performance. But yeah. And I think this is probably something that you see many women actresses do, is have to deal with. There's nothing on the page. I've got to do the rest. I've got to do a lot of the work.
I do think that. Like, I'm not 100% sold that the character's underwritten, but I think if I went back and watched the movie again and I just paid careful attention to only the text of the scene she's in, that might be the case, and the fact that I suspect it might indicate that it is. But like, she is someone who is just performing, and she's so human and alive and feels so well-rounded. With someone who has actions to perform that might not make a great character, and to find the humanity and make a great character, I was like, oh yeah, this is a movie star being born on the screen. Like, what a great movie star she is.
I mean, I can see why all the other characters love her and totally buy. Of course, you would want to love Ella's
just
character.
so
wonderful,
full of like life and energy, and like what a great performance. Yeah. Oh, also like in thinking about why audiences might not like this movie, which is an enjoyable watch. I was trying to pay attention to a little bit of the structure of it, which is so Ella, this is a three-way love story between Ella and Avril and Christopher Walken's character,
Nate
Champion. And you don't meet Ella until well more than an hour into the movie. Like, it is like almost the length of an entire feature film before her character appears.
Yeah.
Like I could see like, oh, that would feel very structured. That's very structurally slow.
Yeah, and Jim Averill, Chris Christopherson's character, has a lady friend that that's into him, and there's all this eye contact in this big, huge opening of the film, the partying and the dancing and the drinking and the punching people in the face. That's his gal or whatever from back east or something like that. So it's a little bit because he shows up. He's got a little buggy and he shows up and here you go, Ella. Here's this buggy, and then the screen lights up when Isabelle Huppert shows up. So yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. What's it? It is a pace that is ponderous, deliberate. All those words I think would apply to that. It's a film that it finds itself. You just got to wait. You got to be a little patient.
I think that is true that it is a movie that demands your patience. But I, for my entire life, thought this movie would be boring. But it was never boring.
No. It's amazing. Because sometimes some films can be like an hour and 10, and they seem to go on forever. And this is one that you will probably check your watch. You watch the sunshine. Where are we at now? But I think, you could do it in a break, do it in 3 breaks. You can easily get through the film.
I do think it's very fascinating that you say that this filmmaker would not cut this movie for television, which is a bold stance for a movie you're trying to make money with in 1980. But I do think this is a movie that is served by changes in technology and culture, where I watched this movie on Amazon Prime. I watched it in 3 sessions, and I had a good time in all 3 sessions. I did not feel bored or tortured because I had the option to be like, well, we'll come back to this tomorrow night and see what's going on. And I think this is a movie that invites that style of viewing. Because of its length, because of its structure.
Yeah, and there's just this simple always stuff going on. They're like those big dense scenes where there's a bunch of stuff going, but there's a lot of quiet moments, and there are these kind of lingering shots. Like you see things where you see characters' faces, the actors convey thinking in it, which is an important skill if you're an actor, and it allows things to develop. It doesn't just it's not let's go on to the next thing. So I think it has I think it's a film that's well worth the effort. Yeah,
a rewarding experience. There's lots to think about. It is not a perfect movie.
No.
But I think that its imperfections are engaging and interesting and fun to think about. This is a movie with with an action climax the length of a regular movie, but it's also a movie that cuts away from its action climax for a debate in a roller rink. Right?
It has it makes interesting and daring choices, to say the least. Things that cut off the momentum, and drag. I think particularly spoil. Don't be too attached to any of these characters because almost all of them will die. That is probably not a spoiler, but it's some of just really I think of RoboCop level people getting shot and dying.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think Christopher Walken's character. It's very Sonny Corleone in the first Godfather, but a little bit extra.
Christopher Walken gets a great death in this movie.
Yes.
A fantastic he is riddled with rifle bullets.
Yeah, he just keeps going
in slow motion for a full 2 minutes.
Yeah, and he'd been shot before several times.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of lead that gets used in this film. So yeah.
Do you want to talk about the ending?
The ending. What about the? Yeah. So
I could see audiences not liking the ending.
Yeah, I would say it's a little Lord of the Rings: Return of the King, since it has basically multiple endings, but they are different kinds of endings that are to me at least increasingly sad and infuriating. So,
yeah, the cavalry shows up. The immigrants lose the battle, and the cavalry also informs them that they are going to lose the war. Yeah.
It's just everything is dust and ruin. Yeah,
our 2 heroes, Ella and Everett, they escape, kind of. They're making their getaway. And then
It looks like it's almost like I think you can imply that they were either married or were going to get married.
they are dressed for a wedding.
Yeah, she's in white. He's all
Yeah.
dapper, more like he would be back east.
It never says this is our wedding day,
Yeah.
but that is the
It's got a real vibe
visual
to it.
implication.
And then you're like, look, the happy couple, and John Bridges as a character named Jeff Bridges as a character named John L. Bridges. Yeah, hey, good to see you. I'll ride you
that
out.
idea that they are going to leave on the carriage is a sad ending. If they get on the carriage and leave, that's a sad ending to the movie because they have lost. That is what he wanted to do the entire movie, but then he realizes that's the wrong thing to do. They fight the war, they lose, and now they're left with nothing to do but flee. So that is a compromise, a sad ending for these characters.
Mm-hmm.
They're leaving Ella is leaving the life that she built. He's living the life that he discovered. They're going to maybe retreat to his class and privilege, which is a moral compromise for him. A sad ending.
Yeah.
And then seemingly, I was really struck by it, like seemingly out of nowhere, they're ambushed by the bad guys in the movie. And it is a violent, they are viciously slaughtered.
Mm-hmm.
Ella is
Gunned down.
in an incredibly violent style.
Yeah.
Jim survives and like barely escapes by the skin of his teeth, and the bad guys kind of run away from after murdering Ella.
It's literally like, did you look in that direction? Literally, it's like, look in that direction. He's right there, and he's just like, ah. It's Sam Waterston's character, Canton, who is clearly the most terrible person in the film by far. He's the least redeemable, and he's clearly the richest and most privileged.
Oh, he has this great line in the middle of the movie where he says they are confronting him about how rich and evil he is, and he says, "My grandfather was the Secretary of War to Harrison. His brother was the governor of the state of New York. My brother-in-law is the Secretary of State, and I represent to you the full authority of the government of the United States and the president."
Yeah, and even if you are of a level of privilege or upper class, that's going to annoy the hell out of you. And especially if you're poor middle class, working class. And it is the first kind of like, he's clearly a dude that doesn't mind, because that question was like, have you like shot anybody? Have you killed anybody? And then he goes out and totally kills somebody just who's defenseless, and he doesn't have a problem killing people. But it seems like the first, like, I'm just really vindictive and I want to shoot you. And so of course, he's got 12 of his buddies there to shoot out. And then, he gets killed. Christopherson survives. He shoots a bunch of people down. All these people deserve to die. But the love of his life.
Yeah, and the final image of that sequence is him holding her body and weeping. And like, to me, it was like the way the ambush is structured, it just sudden. It is shocking.
It's very like abrupt,
but in a way that's like narratively abrupt as well. We're like, what? Why did that happen?
Yeah.
Why is all this happening right now? So like that ending I thought was like real like head scratcher. So you get the sad end. They have lost the war. They have compromised and they're leaving. And then Elle is murdered. But then it has this other closing sequence that like I thought was haunting.
Yes.
So all of a sudden we're disconnected in time. We jump forward some unknown amount of
into
years.
the 20th century. So
Yeah.
1901.
Decades.
Yeah. 1905.
We move
something
forward
like
in time, and we find Jim again. This time on the deck of a steamship off the coast of Rhode Island. I think it's built as.
Newport, Rhode Island. So.
And he is lingering on the deck of the steamship at sunset, and we just watch him. We see him again. He's aged up with makeup, so we get the idea that he's
lost his
older now.
eyebrows.
His look has changed. He's older now.
He's got a mustache. He just looks kind of dried out a little bit more.
And he leisurely walks down below the decks of the steamship to this luxurious cabin where there is another woman who's not Ella, but clearly his wife.
Yeah, she was the wife. She was the woman in the opening scenes that was making eyes at him throughout the whole opening sequence. I believe that's her.
And like she wakes up from her nap with a headache and wants a cigarette, which he leisurely gives to her. And then he stands up and considers her for a moment and walks out of the scene. And I found that to be just a haunting ending to this movie, more so than the violence or like the shocking like ambush. Just the idea that this character does retreat to his wealth and privilege, and he lives a very happy and comfortable life, the life of a millionaire, far away from those immigrant families who stood up for who knows what happened to them. And he is so disconnected and dissatisfied by it, so empty and cold and sort of resigned in those final moments.
Yeah, I think he's on this yacht. It's like his yacht or something that he's on, and it's just bobbing in the ocean, just this is your life now. You have no problems. There's nothing matters. All pain is gone.
Yeah.
And he's kind of. There is a kind of, I guess it was like a rear. There's one bad shot in the is this like.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like you spent all this money and you couldn't do a little better with your rear screen projection because it really looks bad.
It is him standing against the
like,
sunset, and it's very
that,
funny.
That just looks bad.
Yeah.
You know, and if one thing
in a movie filled with fantastic photography.
Yeah. And if it's one thing, that was stylistically a choice throughout the film, I wouldn't think anything of it.
Yeah.
But that really stands out at the end.
A movie that makes beautiful photography in very complicated lighting conditions.
Yeah.
Does dodge it right at the end.
I was like, oh, that just really takes you out. But I get, and it's like it's his artificial life now. No worries.
I was really impressed by that final scene because I think if that movie ends with the death of Ella, I am not as that to me almost was like that was like the filmmaker poking me with a stick. Where he's like, you watch a movie where a bunch of bad things happen. Here's one more bad thing.
It sucks. It's like at the end of James Bond, Her Majesty's Secret Service, where. What's her name gets killed. Like he marries and then he gets to the Contessa and then she gets killed.
Yeah,
but that's terrible. You're so mean and cruel, filmmakers. But yeah,
but those images on the boat really stick with me because it's about that character who has all the things that is promised to a man of his class, and he is made so unhappy by it. It's almost like he's in prison on this yacht.
Yeah.
And I love that narrative trick of it where I'm going to make a movie where it ends with the main character on a yacht and you will be mortified by the image of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I almost did a great thing and now here I am. Yeah, I think it's a perfect end for the film.
Yeah, this is, like you said, an anti-Western, which, like, I think interestingly confronts the idea of American imperialism and also, like, the complicated natures of, like, class and class identity and, like, the abuse between classes. So
I think Richard Masser's character says that he's the railroad station agent. At one point he says at the end, like at one point in the film, he says it's getting where it's a crime to be poor in this country, and obviously like Westerns depict people in kind of tough economic circumstances, but to just be so open and overt about it's something I think that keeps the ideas of the film very relevant, and I think there are plenty of films that came out in 1980 that feel dated in a lot of ways, but this one I think continues to have relevance, particularly given the economic struggles that so many have.
Yeah, I had no problems connecting with this story. I thought it like really felt fresh. And you talk about Cimino as kind of like an egomaniac, but I feel like if I wrote this story, maybe I'd like stand up for it too. I'd maybe fight through the process to tell it my way.
And I'd read a lot of that was something that got out. A lot of the actors and the cinematographer, they were like, hey, he was fine. He's a director. He did a good job. He was like a perfectionist. I think that was. It's the thing. If you want to film at Magic Hour, you got maybe an hour and a half. Like, well, we'll have to do it the next day. And that gets expensive. But that everyone seemed to respect him, and that he wasn't someone who was being abusive to anybody. But he was just taking a long time. Which, it's one thing if you've got a set and you're taking a long time. It's just two characters in a room, and it's another thing if you've got hundreds of extras and a whole set built and things like that. That's going to be different on the budget.
Yeah, a big, ambitious movie. Like I find it hard to fault it for that. Like the story it wants to tell is huge, and it goes about telling it in a huge way.
Yeah, and also and nicely focuses it on a couple of characters to have that intimacy, and then all the other wonderful character actors and supporting actors around the film that make it work. Yeah. I remember I saw it the first time and I thought that's really good, but I think it's the second time watching it for this, I think it's a classic. So it's a film that people should watch at some point in their life. So, and I'm frustrated at what happened to this film, and I feel it's a shame. And it probably wasn't. It was just made at a wrong time. It didn't, that going into the 80s, that was a different dynamic. So
yeah, the story for this movie is they spent too much money on it, but when I sit down to watch it, it wasn't my money that got spent. So like, why am I so invested in that question?
Yeah, and I would say they they put the money, they used what the money you saw spent is on the screen.
Oh yeah,
there.
100%. Yeah.
And there's certain films that bombed that were like, where did that money go? So yeah, this is a good one. We recommend it. So yeah. Any final thoughts that you have about this film?
Oh, I guess I watched this movie. It was streaming on Amazon Prime, and I watched it through that platform. And I don't know why. It was a persistent problem that I have the subtitles turned off, but periodically it would start playing subtitles for the movie, but not from the scene, just like randomly for sections. Subtitles would appear. They were just like other lines of dialogue from previously in the movie or in the future of the movie would appear on the screen. And I just thought that was powerfully meaningful to me. It's like I'm finally setting up to watch Heaven's Gate, this very classically troubled movie. I'm watching it on a digital platform the filmmaker never could have conceived of, and it has an intense, pervasive technical problem. I was like, what a perfect presentation of Heaven's Gate digitally.
Yeah, I remember first I saw it 2014. It was on Netflix, and it was a very like it would go blurry on it. If you're interested right now, whenever this episode comes out, it's currently on the Criterion channel as part of the Razzie nominations, which I shudder to think why this thing would ever get, in looking at this film, why would it ever get any Razzie nominations? There's nothing that's Razzie worthy about this film.
I do feel like I want to talk to the people of 1980, but why are you so mean to this movie?
Yeah, you know.
It just cost a lot. It's not...
It's the dog pile effect. You know, we see that. Imagine if this was on a film like this and the bad press, it was on social media now, which there's a lot of dog piling that comes on film.
Once something gets a little stink on it, people will attack.
And people make good films, people make bad films. It happens. You know, I assume people want to make good films. So, you know, at least respect what they're trying to do. But yeah, it's on Criterion Channel. That's a very good addition, and the subtitles are correct on that one. I think that was one of the things when I started watching part of it on Amazon, and I got rid of the subtitles because they were just, you're right, there's these weird subtitles from 30 minutes before or something like that.
I just thought that was like, that's exactly perfect for Heaven's Gate. They screwed it up when they put it on Amazon.
Poor misunderstood film. So, well, that's all for today. We'll have future episodes where we'll discuss different kinds of box office bombs that perhaps deserve our love or justly deserve our hate. So take care, everybody. Be well out there.